Good day, everybody. So, a lot of people are considering moving from Windows to Linux because Windows 10 support is coming to an end somewhere in October this year, and they worried, not having security updates and all of those things. They've looked into Windows 11 and they don't quite like what they see. Various different reasons. It could be the ads, it could be the AI, it could be the fact that they do things without really asking you, that a power user would actually want to have control over, such as encrypting your drive, not storing your keys locally, all sorts of different things. But I digress. Let's get into just a very short presentation I've prepared. Just to kind of give anybody thinking about moving from Windows to Linux a good idea. This is a guide, not how to install Linux, but just a guide as in terms of what you need to think about, what you need to consider, and so on. So let's start with a few things. You need to consider closed source software versus free and open source software. You have to consider the compatibility of your software or potential alternatives that you could use, your hardware, as well as obviously the various large quantities of options available to you. With Windows, you don't have much of an option. It's Windows 10, 11, you don't really have much of an option. But with Linux, there's different desktop environments, window managers, distributions, etc., etc. We'll get into that a bit later. Let's start with closed source versus open source. So closed source software is normally proprietary. It's owned by a company and it's licensed. Nobody can actually see the source code or the code that was used to write the software besides, actual company employees. You as a user, you have no way of going and double checking things besides just monitoring what the software does. You can't actually look at the code. Whereas the Linux community, we tend to prefer free and open source software. It's not always free, but a lot of times it is open source. So, you can actually be a little bit more at ease knowing that a lot of people that don't have a financial stake in the company have laid eyes on the code, and they've kind of been able to point out whether the code is malicious or not. So free and open source software, it's not always foolproof, but more eyes on the code can result in generally software that is a bit safer to use, and a lot of times it is free to use as well. So if you are a company moving over to it, oftentimes you must just double check the license agreement. Sometimes if you use it for corporate purposes, you do have to buy a license of some kind. But anyways, generally just speaking, free and open source software, bugs get patched a little bit faster because there's a whole community backing the more popular project and working on it, laying eyes on the code, and they can tell the moment something's a little bit dodgy. They can tell, and normally it gets posted all on social media, and the company has to backtrack and whatnot. So anyways, free and open source software, good thing about Linux. Most Linux distributions are also going to be free and open source for you to use. That being said, if free and open source is something that's important to you, just keep in mind some drivers or some parts of some distributions will be closed source and will be proprietary. So again, we'll get to that later when we look at all the options available to you. But just keep that in mind. It's going Linux doesn't always necessarily mean that your whole system entirely would be 100% FOSS. Okay, free open source software. Then let's have a quick look here at compatibility or alternatives to software. Okay, first thing you want to do is, if you're considering moving to Linux, is just check. Maybe the software you're already using on Windows do have Linux equivalents, in which case, great stuff. You just have to, check which distribution the company prefers you to use. A lot of times companies will support Ubuntu or Debian based distributions. They'd have a little package you download and install like you would on Windows, and it runs. Other times you have to install it via an AUR, or you have to download and build the source code, so you'll just want to check. Ideally, you'd want the software you're currently using to have a Linux equivalent. If it does not have a Linux equivalent, then you can search the web for alternative compatible software. In fact, there's a website, I think it's alternative2.net. But normally in forums, people can recommend alternatives and things like that. So just search the web, see if there is a Linux compatible alternative to the software you are using. Look it up online, look at some YouTube videos, see if that software would be something that you'd be comfortable using or transitioning over to, learning to use it. Maybe it works so similar to what you already have. Maybe you'll have to learn some new keyboard shortcuts and things like that. But it's worth a Google. Oftentimes there are alternatives, but you just have to look for them. They're not so obvious. Because remember, a lot of free and open source software, it's free and open source, so they don't have these big marketing budgets, so that everybody knows about it. OBS is software that everyone knows about because streaming has become and content creation has become such a huge thing. But it's open broadcasting software, OBS. So a lot of other projects that work really, really well, they don't have big marketing budgets, and they not so widely used that it's become like a name brand, So just go and search for that. Now, if the first two options fail you, then you can always look at compatibility, that number 3 there, layers, compatibility layers such as Wine. Now, Wine is one of those cool abbreviations. Wine is not an emulator. So the abbreviation is actually part of the name. Okay, I forget what you call it, but Wine is not an emulator. So it doesn't emulate Windows, but it translates Windows calls into the equivalent Linux calls. And a lot of software actually works perfectly fine in this type of environment. And using it, there are a lot of different tools to allow you to easily quote unquote like install a Windows software on your Linux machine and run it. Oftentimes it's as easy as just letting it do its thing. You download it and double click it, you tell it to use the default and it works. Other times you have to try different Wine versions here and there, perhaps follow a tutorial online to get it working. But again, that's something you can look into. If you don't feel like that's something you want to do, by all means stay on Windows. We also, for gaming, most games that don't have Linux specific or native Linux sort of, what's it called? Native Linux clients would use Wine, a version of Wine modified by Valve, which is called Proton, that allows the game to run. So gaming has come a long way. Most games actually render perfectly fine on Linux. It's just those pesky little anti-cheat softwares that's still bugging the heck out of us. And there are websites that you can go and check for your favorite games, where you can go and search and see what the compatibility is like. Do you need to do anything, or can you just install it and run it? There are websites. I will link some useful links down in the description where you can go and check compatibility for gaming and stuff like that. Even some software, if I remember to do that. Anyways, and then of course, if you don't have a native thing for the software that you use, and if there's not a viable alternative, and if compatibility layers seems to not work, I know with something like Fusion 360, you can get it to run, but it's not great. It was very finicky last time I tried it with Wine. So sometimes you then just have to change, maybe move over to a different platform. In terms of Fusion 360, you might then want to say, well, let me learn how to use FreeCAD, or maybe one of those Onshape, I think it is, that's web only, something like that, that you can just design in your browser. So change. Sometimes we do actually just need to change. If Windows is bugging you so much, or if you are so worried about the support being taken away from you, and you just want something that is reliable, then change is perhaps something. Perhaps you can look at your workflow and see if you can't make changes so that you can overcome these like software limitations. Perhaps there's something you could do that would enable you to completely cut out one of these software solutions that you require. Perhaps you are someone who does videography, and every single time when you download something from an SD card, you run a program to convert it, and that program is not here. Well, perhaps you can change something in your camera settings. Perhaps you can change the format that the camera records in to be more compatible with the software that is available, just as an example. But that's something to think about as well. It's just actually changing your workflow. Right. So I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions about compatibility and stuff, please do leave a comment below. Next, I want to chat about hardware. One of the big reasons why a lot of people are going to be stressing about October is the TPM and security. A lot of slightly older machines don't support the necessary TPM chips that Windows 11 requires. So now you either have to get a new computer just for Windows 11, or you've got to make a plan with what you've got. So again, this video is more for making a plan with what you got, right? So Linux, there are secure options. There are encryption is available. There are options that will make use of the TPM. There's options that make use of secure boot, etc., etc., etc. But with older machines, generally, we don't have the required TPM chips, and we don't really worry too much about secure boot. And unless you are like having like corporate secrets and stuff on your system, generally for the average user, like especially a home user, even gamers, we don't require encryption. So please be careful. A lot of people have complained with Windows 11 now that it's encrypted the drive, and when their system crashed and they took the drive out, put it into a new system, no access to the drive. And when they check their Microsoft account, the key wasn't backed up. So encrypting a drive can be big hassles, all right? And a lot of Linux distributions will have encryption enabled by default while you're clicking through. My recommendation is, unless you are dealing with sensitive information that potentially people would want to steal or gain access to, don't encrypt your drive. Okay, your selfies and your casual messages to your friends and stuff on Discord and whatnot, and your stuff. Most of us won't need encryption. We're not that big targets. So don't encrypt your drive unless you feel like it's absolutely necessary. On Linux, if something breaks and you can't actually boot into the system and you need to try and fix it, a lot of tutorials will be able to help get you back into your system without needing to format and restart and all that stuff. But if it's encrypted, those tutorials needs additional steps to get around the encryption, and a lot of them just don't have it. So again, encryption is available in Linux. Linux can be very secure, but I would avoid encrypting for like the average user. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant. Wi-Fi networking, normally if you have booted into your sort of live Linux distribution, and you on the install page and you manage to connect and the display is working and everything seems to be running fine, you're hearing audio out of your speakers in the live distribution, that normally means that that's fine, you won't have any issues. Generally speaking, most Linux distributions and the Linux kernel has enough drivers to get your machine running. Okay, but there are some niche cases where you might have to download and install drivers for specific hardware requirements. So run a live distribution first, test it out, make sure everything's working before you go and install it, only to reboot and then realize that some of your hardware is not working. Talking about GPUs now, AMD, NVIDIA, and Intel are all supported. On the AMD side, you do have open source drivers, which is amazing. Most AMD users will use the open source drivers. It's baked into the kernel. Basically, you install Linux, you boot it, it runs. You don't really worry about installing a AMD driver. For specific applications for hardware acceleration, you might need to install the proprietary AMD driver. NVIDIA in recent months have made very good progress with the NVIDIA open source driver, but for most people who are new to Linux, you would want to use the closed source driver from NVIDIA when you are running Linux, especially when you're going to be trying to enable hardware acceleration and gaming. Very important. The open source driver is getting there, but it's not quite on par with the AMD open source driver. Intel, I can't say much, but they do have drivers for Intel, and compatibility is there if you have Intel dedicated GPU. Intel integrated or onboard graphics should just work out of the box, without much hassles or issues. Hardware acceleration is available for most applications like Blender, video processing applications, things like that. Hardware acceleration is available. However, you would need to check specifically if your hardware is supported, as some older, especially like some older AMD cards, won't have hardware acceleration for Blender, as an example. And so on. So just double check it, but it is definitely available. A lot of people have this misconception that Linux and hardware acceleration don't really go well together, but it does. And then upgrading and swapping out parts. So again, if you've avoided the TPM security keys and all of those things with encryption, then upgrading and swapping out parts on a Linux system is super easy. You can replace the entire system. You can take the hard drive out and put it into a completely different system and boot, and Linux will just be like, okay, cool, there's new hardware, and move on with its life. Whereas with Windows, it would be like, we detected new hardware. Your license is not valid for this hardware. You have to buy a new license. Or it might, in the case of encrypting, it might say, oh no, we don't recognize this TPM key. So you don't have access to your data. So with Linux, upgrading, swapping out parts, fiddling with things is much easier. It just does. It just goes, and it's like, well, okay, cool. Stuff has changed. The motherboard changed, the whatever changed, and it just carries on. If it has the support for it, it runs it, no issues. Windows, yeah, issues. Activation issues and things like that. So let's have a look at some options. When you first start looking at Linux, you're going to be bombarded with options, different desktop environments, different distributions, window managers. You're going to be like, what does all this mean? Well, this little thing is hopefully going to explain some of that to you. So first, I want to chat about the Windows system. So that manages the display and sort of the windowing system. Okay, and not the display so much, but the windowing system. How things are actually rendered on your screen. X11 or X.org or Xorg, however you want to go about it. That's the older one. It has the most support at the moment. I've got some closed source software for my drawing tablet that actually gives me errors on Wayland, which is the new one. It doesn't quite detect exactly where my monitors are, so when I start drawing, it actually draws on half of the monitor instead of the whole monitor. Whereas on X11, that software works. Because I expect the developers for my tablet, my drawing tablet, develop their software for X11 support. So Wayland is getting there, and they're working on ways to kind of emulate all the software to be compatible with Wayland, or rather other way around, Wayland be compatible with all the software that was designed for X11. But if you're a new Linux user, to have this sort of smoothest, least amount of hassles, I would say go with X11. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about that when we get to the distributions, okay? Because some distributions don't ship with X11, others do, etc., etc. Anyways, the next thing you want to consider is your GUI, your graphical user interface. If you want one, generally there's two different options. There's desktop environments, so that could be GNOME, KDE, Cinnamon, XFCE, a whole bunch. It's a desktop environment. It makes it look pretty. There's taskbars and buttons you can click on and menus you can go interact with. That's what you as the user, that your graphics that you will be interfacing with. So there's desktop environments, and then there's window managers. Window managers are more for like the power users. You generally can't just click something and drag it around, but you use a lot of keyboard shortcuts to arrange your windows, and sometimes when you open a new program, it automatically decides where it's going to place it on your screen. So it's still a graphical interface, but you're not interacting with it so much with the mouse. It's less like Windows and more like something you'd see in like a hacker kind of sci-fi movie. Okay. And then there's CLI, command line interface, which is headless. Obviously, if you're going to be moving over from a Windows server to a Linux server, you do also have the option to just run the server in command line interface. So it doesn't have any graphics, it just displays text, and you have a terminal that you type commands into and you navigate that way. Again, mostly just engineers and power users will be using CLI. Let's have a quick look about the quick chat, about the distributions, or distros as they are called. There are many pre-configured setups. A distribution is essentially a Linux package that comes with certain things, So if you look at one distribution, it might come with a Windows system X11 and a desktop environment KDE. And then SDDM, which is a display manager, and etc. etc. It's all packaged into one little thing. So you as a user just install it and you use it, and you are blissfully unaware of everything that's happening in the background. You could make your own, but again, that's more like power user stuff, where you pick exactly which packages are installed and which systems are installed. For new people, I would stay away from doing that. Just pick one of the sort of recommended new distribution things. And you also want to consider a distribution that's Arch-based or Debian-based. The Arch-based distributions tend to be a little bit more for power users. So if you're a Windows person that really likes fiddling with configuration files and, really likes fiddling with all the settings and changing things up, an Arch-based distribution could be for you. It has a bit more of a steeper learning curve, but like I say, it's more geared or more suited to a power user. Debian-based is a lot of like your Ubuntu type distributions where things just work. The commands are very easy. It's literally, to install a program, it's apt install to install a program. Whereas to install a program on Arch-based stuff, it's pacman capital S, lowercase, other things. You can change the commands up to change its behavior, and it gets more complicated. But yeah, that's something to consider. If you're a power user, Arch-based distros could be for you. Otherwise, if you just want, a smooth, easy, simple experience, Debian-based distributions is for you. Now, what is Arch? Arch is actually a Linux distribution, okay? And Debian is also a distribution in its own right. But both of those are very power user sort of oriented. So I say Arch-based and Debian-based because distributions based on these two would have a whole bunch of stuff added on that you as a user might need to use that you won't have to think about. Support as well. For Linux, the largest amount of support will come from community forums, so it's going to be free. If you're running a business and you installing Linux on a few machines, you could probably Google stuff and ask questions on forums, and you'd get support that way. If you're a larger company, there are services out there that are paid, so they are professional, qualified Linux engineers that are employed to kind of help you out with your Linux rollout and etc. etc. So both free and paid options are there. For most users, the community forums and things would be more than sufficient. Moving on, some beginner distros just to kind of look into. If you're looking for something that just works and you're not running the latest and greatest hardware, super high end stuff that just got released last month, if you're running a cool computer and you just want to do your thing and not have to worry too much about things breaking and crashing and needing updates all the time, then the stable basic use over here would be for you. So Linux Mint is these days probably the go-to for most new people moving from Windows to a Linux-based system. It basically comes with everything you need. It has a familiar interface no matter which desktop environment you choose. When you go to Linux Mint's download page, you'll see there are, I think, 3 or 4 different desktop environments. All of them have a similar layout to your old school sort of Windows 7 and Windows 10. So it's very familiar. You know, the clock's in the same spot, the audio controls are in the same spot, the start menu is in the same spot, etc., etc. So Linux Mint definitely to go for. However, it does use a long-term service kernel, or the LTS kernel, so it's very stable, but it won't necessarily support something, you know, a new CPU or a new GPU that just got released like last week. That being said, it's Linux, so you could potentially have a workaround to download the required drivers and things and integrate it and get it to work. But, you know, if you're just running a computer that's a few years old and you just want it to be stable and not crash and work, Linux Mint, definitely my top recommendation. Then, if you focus more on gaming, PC gaming, then normally PC gamers, we, you know, quite comfortable fiddling with files, diving into a file system, finding a configuration file and editing it and things like that. So slightly more advanced distributions here, but still fairly beginner friendly, is the Garuda Dragonite Gaming Edition. It comes pre-installed with most of the gaming packages and things that you might need. Pop! OS, also gaming orientated, although Pop! OS, again, not so much for latest and greatest hardware. You might have to jump through some hoops to get some of the newer, latest stuff to work on the Pop! OS. Pop! OS is also not updating their kernels and stuff as frequently, which is great for stability. If you get something working and it works, happy times, fun times. But they're also working on their own desktop environment, so it's, yeah, that's worth mentioning. Both of those won't have like a familiar Windows type interface, but it is a modern interface. You'll get used to it quite quickly. Then if you're an absolute power user, but you're still not quite ready to install, you know, just plain Debian or plain Arch, Endeavour OS, that's great. Upon installation, you can choose to install multiple desktop environments. You can test them all out. You can choose to install the LTS kernel as well as the Zen kernel and the latest and greatest kernel. I actually recommend, if you do go with Endeavour OS, to install both the LTS kernel and at least either the Zen kernel or the latest kernel. Having that LTS kernel as a backup, you know, in case something does go wrong on the new kernel, you can just easily boot into LTS and it should save you. Then there's also a Fedora workstation, very stable. It's built for workstations, so it comes pre-packaged with a lot of hardware acceleration packages, support for hardware acceleration, things like that. Again, not going to be a familiar interface. I can't remember exactly what desktop environment Fedora workstation uses, but it's fairly doable. I think it's GNOME. And yeah, like I said, Endeavour OS, you can install a whole bunch, and on your login screen, you can actually pick and choose between them and see which ones you like. And Endeavour OS is Arch-based, so if you're searching for any sort of issues you need help with, you can actually use the Arch Wiki or any like Arch sort of forums. Most of those commands will basically translate directly into what you need for Endeavour OS. So that's another bonus there. Linux Mint is Ubuntu based, which is Debian based. So any Ubuntu type tutorials and stuff will work for Linux Mint as well. Well, most of the time. Yeah, if you're willing to try something new, Ubuntu and Fedora, because they don't ship with something that's like a Windows-esque desktop environment, so go for that. In my experience, I've been using Linux for many years now. Online guides, about 70% of the time you would find Ubuntu stuff or Debian-based, you know, help if you search for a problem. Linux issue this. Most of the stuff you're going to find is going to be Debian Ubuntu-based. And then the power users, like if you're fiddling with like an issue that is really sort of unique, most of the time you'll be finding Arch-based tutorials and guides for that. Like I say, Arch-based distributions are going to be a little bit more for the power user, more advanced users, so just keep that in mind. But generally, most of the tutorials I see that deals with sort of easier to deal with issues will be Ubuntu or Debian based, beginner stuff. Finally, if you don't quite want to wipe out your Windows completely, you want to try Linux a little bit before you completely wipe out Windows, dual booting is an option. By far the best way to dual boot is to have Windows installed already. It's just because of the way Windows does things with boot managers and stuff upon installation. Having it installed first, then installing Linux alongside it. Most Linux distributions have an option while you're installing it that you can click that says install alongside. Then it will help you partition, or it will help you select another disk. I recommend having a separate drive that you can install Linux on. And then, yeah, you can dual boot. So when you start up your computer, you can select Windows or Linux, and you can try out Linux. And if you still not quite sure, still hunting for software alternatives, you can boot back into Windows, do your work, and, backwards and forwards. So dual booting is an option. Yeah, I don't recommend just nuking your Windows completely if you've never used Linux. I definitely dual boot first. Or if you're fortunate enough to have multiple computers, maybe have Windows on one, Linux on the other. That could be an option. And finally, please subscribe if you found this video entertaining, helpful in any way. And please do leave any comments below. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer those. If I can, I'm by no means an expert on Linux, but definitely I hope that this video sort of gave you some pointers and some advice, some things to consider. Thank you so much for watching, and have a good day. Bye.